Thank you so much for coming. Jesus is always an enticing topic, although my subtitle might raise some interesting questions that I hope that you will get a broader sense for some of the issues here. The title was not difficult to come up with because I just finished a summer course at Rhodes entitled Jesus Then and Now. So that was good preparation, and I kind of just harvested the best parts out of that course and put them together here for you today. This is a little bit different than a lot of discussions about Jesus, which tend to focus on his life, that 30-year period in the first century. I think that's an interesting pursuit, but we are incredibly limited about what we can say. And so I've been increasingly interested in what people do with the figure of Jesus. And this can be wonderful, progressive things, but there can also be quite a dark side too. So we're going to be kind of exploring that range throughout history. So I guess I'm going to start with, I kind of want to start big and think about what does it mean to study Jesus, and then we'll focus in on this sort of look at how he's been used through history. And this is called reception history, and I'll explain a little bit more about that momentarily. I put my email address up there just because, as I offer to my students, if you have any questions or thoughts or want to remember a reference that I mentioned here, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I love to talk about this stuff, so when stuff shows up in my inbox, I'm happy to engage about it. So, yeah.
June 23rd, 34.
Yes. How did that happen? Somebody should have caught that, me. So I guess I was imagining great things for myself in the future.
You're a true visionary.
Yes. 1,000 years, what this might look like. I am also willing to share the PowerPoint with anybody who wants it. If you reach out by email, that will be changed by the time I send it to you. All right, so before we get into any kind of talking about Jesus, we need to kind of distinguish two different ways that research takes place in the study of religion, and some of you might be familiar with this distinction. But the basic distinction is what's called the academic critical study of Jesus or the theological confessional study of Jesus. And the basic difference is what takes place in a secular university by people who may be but are not necessarily committed Christians, and those in a theological confessional context. And when we're talking about Jesus himself, the question tends to be, are we talking about the historical person or the figure who functions in faith beliefs for people that we can't really prove historically, but that's not really the point of that figure. It's a figure of faith. So there's a couple sort of ways that this gets divided. So the historical Jesus, which I will say a little bit about here at the beginning. So this is the man who lived for roughly 33 years in the first century. There have been extensive efforts to study this person for the last 250 years or so. I'll give you basic kind of history of that. People who do this work are usually not interested in proving faith claims. So anything like Jesus was the Son of God, that's interesting. That's definitely an item of faith that many people share. But there's not really a way to prove that with any ancient documents, any archaeological information. So those questions are kind of bracketed. When people who study the historical Jesus do talk about those questions, they tend to frame them in terms of people claim that this happened, and we can't prove it, but we know that somebody believed that. And then the Christ of faith, again, who functions in belief systems for Christians. So we're actually going to see today that there have been other Jesuses that have functioned in faith systems for non-Christians in interesting ways. And this tends to be studied in what we refer to as theology, which is people who are trying to find historical truths, trying to find truths about those faith claims. So theologians spend time, studying texts, looking at particular words, looking at how we can conclude these claims of faith. And that often does have implications for religious practice, whereas studying the historical Jesus, as I will mention shortly, doesn't always have implications for historical practice. Sometimes the Jesus that is uncovered by scholars is somebody that is not that complex of a figure because there's not really that much data. Both are fine, completely legitimate approaches, but it's just understanding the distinction between the two and what is appropriate in which context. and also realizing that they don't always necessarily speak to each other. So what counts as evidence for theologians is different than what counts as evidence for historians. I try to put a lot of pictures on here. There's a lot of text too in the PowerPoint, just to, especially once we get to examples, I want to show you exactly what texts say about Jesus. But this one, this is kind of a famous relic of historical Jesus scholarship. It came out around the year 2000, and they called it at that point a computer generated. We might call it AI today. Of an ordinary Jewish person. So they were trying to get at what did Jesus actually look like, or just basically a basic Jewish person in that time frame. So that has been a very kind of intriguing and alluring, and as you might imagine, contested by some American Christians who do not want to understand Jesus like that. Another caveat, so if we're interested in history, which is what most of this talk today is going to be about. Another caveat is, are we talking about the actual historical Jesus or what's called the reception history of Jesus? We're going to focus mostly on the reception history here because it's utterly fascinating when you just start to kind of stack up the different ways that people have understood and engaged with Jesus throughout history. Both of these are historical pursuits, so you're looking for historical data about who the actual person was, or historical data about what people have done with him. And this is everything from writings, songs, movies, things like that. Those are all moments of reception history. Let me explain the meme first. I think this is, I just ran across this on the internet somewhere, and I like it because it kind of encapsulates this idea that who the historical Jesus was is this tiny little square of information, but you can build a whole other figure around it. And in this case, they've turned him into a guitar shredding legend here. So that's kind of an image of what we're going to see happen in mostly textual form, although there are a few images. And I also included a quote from one of my favorite scholars who wrote this short but very intriguing book called The Symbolic Jesus. And a lot of it is sort of detailed stuff about scholarship itself and like what it's been up to, but in there he says people use the figure of Jesus as a screen or symbol on which to, that will be changed to if anybody wants it, a symbol onto which to project contemporary cultural debates and to employ the inherent authority of this Jesus figure to advance one or another particular stance on these issues. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be focusing on in just a second once I tell you a little bit more about the history. And I tried to pick kind of extreme examples because if we can see people kind of co-opting Jesus in extreme examples where it's so obvious that they're, distorting him for a particular interest, then it makes it easier to kind of think about it when we see just ordinary representations of Jesus and to say, well, there might be a little, tweaking and even just one that seems sort of ordinary. So some of you may be familiar with this because popular readers do tend to have a general sense of, what are called the quests for the historical Jesus. So this is roughly an effort that's been taking place since the Enlightenment, and so usually it gets broken down into different stages. So there's a first quest, the no quest, I'll say something about that. Note the very misleading title. The second or the new quest, and then the third quest, which got a lot of attention. If you've ever heard of the Jesus Seminar, that took place during that. And there's a kind of interesting, ambiguous question of where we are today. So I'll just briefly run through these to give you a sense for how this scholarship developed. And again, this is all going to be focused on who that person was in the first century, what did he do in his life, what can we know. So the first one took place starting about the Enlightenment, when, to be honest, that was the first time when people could actually ask critical questions about the Bible. So this was the first time when people started to say, well, maybe Jesus didn't actually say everything in the Bible. Maybe his followers added something onto it. And so this actually takes place in what's called a liberal Protestant environment. So a kind of environment, probably much like this environment, where you could think critically about biblical text, and nobody's going to come, burn down your house or something like that. There was a time when if you did say critical things about the Bible, you were ostracized, you lost teaching positions at places. So this is when people are starting to be more progressive in thinking about what these texts are as human products. So this was the first time we get this goal of differentiating between the ideas of Jesus people have in religion and in their faith-based beliefs, and then who that person might be who lived for 30, 33 years in the first century. That goes roughly until World War I, and then many popular books describe the period in World War II, World War I and World War II, as the no-quest period, and that historical Jesus scholarship was paused. This is quite misleading because, and this is something we're only now starting to reckon with, there was scholarship in Europe that was being produced by Jesus by committed Nazi scholars, and some of it is still floating around today. There's a famous example. I have a copy of it on my shelf because I was looking for some examples of how these anti-Jewishness kind of sneaks in. It's called the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. It's a massive multiple volume set produced by somebody who definitely was a Nazi, definitely wrote on the Jewish question and what to do with Jewish people in German society. So I think it's misleading to say that because we need to reckon with what biblical scholars have done and see how that influence still exists. People still use that theological dictionary. Okay, so what's called the Second Quest started after World War II, and this tends to be a little bit more progressive in the sense that they started to use what is called the criteria of authenticity, so kind of methodological guidelines for assessing which things came from Jesus in the Gospels and which things didn't. So for instance, one of them is called the criteria of multiple independent attestation. Kind of a mouthful. But the basic idea there is that if you find, let's say, a teaching of Jesus that shows up in multiple early texts, more than one, it would be great if it were more, 4 or 5, and the texts don't have a relationship to each other, like one was copying off the other, then that teaching is more likely to be authentic. A good example is the parable of the mustard seed. That one, it's simplistic, shows up in slightly different forms in a few different places. And so that was a way to kind of take all the stuff about Jesus and sort of peel away some of it and get maybe what's an authentic core. There was a bit of a problem in that period because there was this assumption that Jesus was somehow better than his Jewish context. So they privileged anything that, for instance, tried to seem to correct Judaism or, really correct or fix or any kind of supersessionist theology, which has been corrected a little bit recently in the Third Quest, which roughly goes from the 80s to the year 2000, maybe a little bit later. But the efforts in that quest, first of all, they used a lot of social scientific frameworks, which was very interesting. So looking at cultural models, like how social movements form, peasant politics and things like that to understand what Jesus was doing. And this really said, okay, Jesus is not doing something other than Judaism. He is doing a form of Judaism, and most people would have recognized it as that. And then it's only later that it turns into something that's radically different with a whole, institutional structure. And this quest was helped in part by, you may have heard the Dead Sea Scrolls before. Those were actually discovered in the 1940s, but when they became popularly accessible and translated was a little bit later. And those really helped scholars see how diverse ancient Judaism was. So it's not like Judaism was fixed and Jesus did something completely different. It's that Judaism was all over the place, and Jesus was one moment in that all over the place sort of thing. So notice that ends at the year 2000. I already mentioned the Jesus Seminar in there, which I do not believe it meets anymore, or it might meet in a slightly different form, but it's definitely not as sort of popular and in the public eye as it used to be. Like there was a famous Time magazine cover that dealt with the Jesus Seminar, and they got covered in popular media, which was an interesting moment in bringing scholarship to sort of lay people. But they received a lot of criticism for that in the sense of, were they playing to the masses kind of thing. But they produced a lot of important scholarship in that time period. So we're not totally sure where we are now, but this book, if you can't see the title, it says The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus, is forthcoming this year. And yours truly has contributed to it. And it's the kind of goal of what they're calling the next quest here is to figure out what are the things we need to kind of deal with before we can even hope to find Jesus underneath the text. So some things are ancient compositional patterns. We need to understand how ancient authors worked and like what were their habits and techniques before we can say, okay, so this is the form they put on it. What might be the traditions that lie underneath it? Another different kind of example is understanding ancient forms of, or ancient assumptions about masculinity. And so particularly with a gospel like the Gospel of Luke, many scholars have made excellent cases that the author of the Gospel of Luke is interested in depicting Jesus as an ideal man. So there's kind of this interest that, and by that I mean he's a kind of stoic figure, he's in control of himself, he's a good public speaker, he's persuasive. So these are all ancient ideals about masculinity. So once you kind of deal with that and realize that that's going on, that makes you think of the Gospel of Luke different, and you kind of have to peel off these framing efforts to make him into an ideal man, and then kind of get underneath it. Okay, I had a couple slides that I took out just in the interest of time, but all of these three quests in particular have been problematized in important ways, and this is fine. This is how scholarship happens. People do things, people come along later and talk about its shortcomings. And one of the shortcomings, and I will just read a quote from a scholar called Helen Bond. She says, the quests were largely agreed to be, quote, too Western, too white, too bourgeois, and too male. So these have been critiqued on sort of all those grounds, that they came from the perspective of a very particular group of people who were scholars, and that there might be other perspectives that we need to take into account. And to be honest, many of the problems associated with the quest exist because of the nature of the evidence. All we have are texts written by people other than Jesus. It's pretty elite literature. I mean, most people are not reading and writing in the ancient world, so the people who are writing, it's a very small slice. Some of the Gospels have literary relationships to each other, which complicates things. And I don't think this is too controversial. The Gospels are not what we would call neutral accounts. They are interested in showing Jesus in a very particular light. So we need to figure out what that is before we can even sort of go underneath that. But that is for another day, because I'm going to argue that reception history is actually more important than that 30-year period somewhere in the past that's pretty occluded to us. So there's a lot on here, and I'll kind of read through this for some of y'all in the back. So I've made the claim before that ancient people were not interested in the historical Jesus. That's our interest. And for some people, that can be a little disturbing to hear. But the reason I say this is actually the second point, which is this guy, the historical Jesus, immediately gets buried under creative theological representations, and those are the things that dominate people's understandings. And I've just given a few examples from the New Testament itself. Now, these are not wildly different. It's not like people read these texts and think that they're talking about a different person. It's clear that it's Jesus. But the Jesus, for instance, in Paul's letters, he did not really say anything about his early life, none of the miracles he did other than resurrection, none of the sort of ethical teachings and things like that. By the time we get to Paul, which about 10, 15 years after the death of Jesus, Jesus really only matters for his atoning death, so life not that important for what Paul's talking about, and future apocalyptic return. In the Gospel of Mark, we get also a non-neutral presentation. So he's a kind of enigmatic Messiah who's in some ways actively withholding his identity, and if you read it for this motif, you can see that it's very much a tragedy because the whole, the characters are consistently misunderstanding him. juxtapose that with Matthew and Luke, both of those depict Jesus as somebody who is recognized as important from the very beginning, from his infancy. So there's already different emphases there, and I've already kind of talked about the Gospel of Luke and the way that he foregrounds this idea of Jesus as an ideal man, which, by the way, would fit in with Roman ideas about ideal men. So Luke is trying to make Jesus look good to a certain kind of person. A third reason, and I don't mean this like in any kind of critical way, but even when confronted with counter evidence, people still tend to believe what they want. And I think that's actually okay. That's the function of faith. You don't need the evidence for those kinds of beliefs. That's how it's supposed to work. So, there is very interesting evidence for Jesus did or did not say certain things. But in some ways, it doesn't matter, because what's functioning for people in religious context is the fullness of it. And this is what the rest of my talk today is going to get into. Expressions of reception history have actually been way more influential than who that guy was for 33 years. He immediately gets covered up, and the covering up just continues in different ways. So, we're about to embark on a whirlwind journey through the last 2,000 years of reception history. This, by the way, was the background on my syllabus for my students, so I just took it out. All of those are AI depictions. I had a very interesting time seeing what AI programming would generate when you put in different prompts. Okay, so apologies for all the text. I'll try to read as much as possible for you, just depending on how close you are to the screen, but I really do want you to see the moments in which the transformations happen. Okay, we do have a lot of content if we don't get through it all. So basically it's case studies, and even if we don't get through every case study, I think you're still going to get the point that I'm kind of getting across. So let's actually start continuing in the New Testament. So in the Apocalypse of John, also called the Book of Revelation, so this is late 1st century. For all of these, I've tried to give you when they show up and what kind of Jesus they are promoting. And by the way, if you haven't gone to this website, the Brick Bible, which is a Lego illustration of everything in the Bible, I actually love to use it in class because it often fixates on details that my students regularly overlook. For instance, if you read, Revelation 19. So this is when Jesus is leading the armies of heaven on a white horse against Satan and his allies. It says he's on a rider that had blazing eyes, and his head are many crowns, not just one, but many, hence the many crowns. He's dressed in a robe dripped in blood, so we have a nice little garment here. His name is the Word of God. Out of his mouth comes a sharp sword. So there's literally, if we're looking at the literal imagery, now this could be working symbolically, of course. And there's even a further part of this that says he had another name written on his thigh. I know you can't see it from here, but there's even a little word down there. So this, I think, really helps people see what the literal text says. So my argument with the Apocalypse of John is, gone is the Jesus of the Gospels, or most of that. So we don't get any ethical teachings. We don't get this gentle person who walks around telling people to turn the other cheek. Who just sort of teaches crowds and stuff. He shows up as a kind of apocalyptic warrior, leading armies of heaven to defeat Satan and his human allies. So it's ramping up the picture of Jesus. And it's actually because of the violence in here that when people were putting together the New Testament, and we have good records for this, that people debated whether or not this should even be in the Bible, because some people were like, this is not the Jesus from these other texts. It ultimately got in there. But so even ancient people noticed this difference. Okay, so now on to an example that some of you may know, but I would wager to guess not necessarily as many, even though it's been in the news recently. A great text called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, so 2nd century roughly. This is a text that depicts Jesus from about 5 to 12 years old, goes all the way up to the story that's actually the same in the Gospel of Luke when he gets lost in the temple during Passover, and he's talking to the scribes and things like that. The Jesus in here is very different than the New Testament. He is powerful, impetuous. He is violent, people die in this at his hands. It's very interesting to read. My students tend to be sometimes very surprised and intrigued. I've had some students get very upset about this. So I just gave you one example here. So this is from when he's 5, and somehow it got illustrated in a cartoon, which I found on the internet. I have no idea the circumstances that led to this. But so Jesus is he's playing in the waters and like gathering the waters together with his miraculous powers. Another boy comes along and like messes up his puddle. Jesus becomes angry, so already there's a kind of emotional figure in there. And so this is all being translated from Greek, and so there's a little bit of flexibility in what this could mean. But you godless, brainless moron, what did the pond waters do to you? Watch this now. You're going to dry up like a tree, and you will never produce leaves or roots or fruit. And then the child withered up completely, which is a very interesting phrase. And I always ask my students, does this mean that the child is dead? What's going on? And most of them say yes, because you go a little further and they take the child's remains away. Now, this did not end up in the New Testament. I think we can all come to some very good reasons why. But this may have actually been written by a sincere Christian who was really struggling with the idea of, if Jesus is so powerful, in his adult life, how did he handle that when he was a kid? Especially because we know what kids are like. They are like this. Sometimes they get in trouble. They say things they don't mean. They, learn how to hit people before they're told not to. So this is kind of an interesting moment in reception history where people may have been fine with the Jesus who is on the books, but they really wanted to know what happened in those earlier years, in what are called the lost years. Those are going to show up a little bit later too. So there's basically a gap in Jesus' life between 12 years old and roughly late 20s to 30. And people do a lot with that, as we will see. All right, I'm going to do one more early Christian, and then we're going to launch off into some much later stuff, including the Quran. So the next text that you may have heard of too, the Gospel of Judas. This is not in the New Testament. If you've ever heard of the Gnostic Gospels, this is one of those. This one's fascinating because we had references to it in ancient writing, but we didn't have a copy until 1970, which is just amazing to think what else is out there, what's going to show up. And even then, it looked like that. So it took time to both get the actual letters off of it and reconstruct the kind of holes that are missing. So in the quote that I've got here, anytime you see anything in brackets, that is kind of filling in what scholars think was probably in those holes. It's, kind of speculation, but it's disciplined speculation. So this probably comes from roughly the 2nd century. And here, it's not a completely different figure, but it's just a different spin on the same guy. He's a kind of spiritual teacher who actually pities a lot of his gospels because he thinks or a lot of his disciples, because he thinks they're worshiping the wrong gods. And this actually has to do with the theology of Gnostic Christianity. It's quite complicated, but they have a very kind of busy cosmos and like different entities at different levels, the material world versus the spiritual world. So one of the things that Gnostic claims was that Jewish people and mainstream Christians are worshiping the wrong God. They're being deluded into something, and they need to be woken up to know who the real God is. So in this, a couple interesting things are happening. One is that Jesus is primarily a teacher. There is an indication that he dies at the end, but it's not an atoning death. It's just what happens to him. It's an unfortunate tragedy. His main function is to teach people esoteric knowledge and help them figure out the true nature of reality. I've put just a few examples on here. So, and Judas has a completely different role in this too. Judas is a kind of comrade of Jesus as they're working together to accomplish a very specific thing. So at one point, Jesus says to Judas, step away from the others and I'll tell you the mysteries. So he's giving Judas special teachings that the other disciples didn't get. And again, down here, he says, I'm going to teach you about secrets that nobody has seen. So there's a lot of secrecy in Gnosticism. And then this last one, amazing statement. Judas says to Jesus, look, those who have been baptized in your name, what will they do? and then a little bit's broken out, but then Jesus says, you will exceed all of them, you will sacrifice the man that clothes me, which most scholars take as an indication that Jesus used Judas in order to accomplish his death, because that's what had to happen for this understanding here. So Judas is necessary, and he's part of the plan. He's not the villain, which, again, fascinating. So a very different kind of understanding of Jesus here. I'm going to fast forward a few hundred years to the Quran, which, as many of you know, has a lot to say about Jesus, a surprising amount. And it's unfortunate that most Americans don't realize the significant overlap between, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They're all Abrahamic traditions. So the Quran is revealed over a period of decades, but roughly 7th century is what we're talking about here, Arabia. Jesus is the second most important prophet in Islam. He's a human, he's a prophet, and he does important stuff, by the way, at the end times. Like, he fights the Antichrist at the end times. So it's not that different than Christianity. The main point of difference is that he is not a divine figure at all, and there's very explicit stuff about that in the Quran. But he does miracles. Give you one example up here. One of the miracles that he does actually comes from the moment of his birth, and this is a very strange little statement. But so Mary conceived also miraculously. By the way, Mary is a huge deal in the Quran too. So she goes to a remote place on her own, and so in the midst of pains of childbirth, she's having a difficult time and, needs water, food, things like that. And it says he called from below her and basically, pacifies her and tells her that there's food and water nearby. Scholars of Islam take this to mean that literally he is being born and the infant baby speaks to her. So this is a miracle. But it's a very kind of different understanding of Jesus as an infant that we don't really see we do not see a speaking infant in the New Testament. So still miraculous elements. And then I also included this because there's a lot of polemical material in the Quran that is sure to differentiate themselves from Christians. So Jesus is the Messiah in the Quran too, so he's a liberating figure. They call him the Messiah, the Son of Mary. He's just a messenger of Allah. So do not say three, which means do not believe the Trinity, is the idea there. Desist, it's better for you. Allah is but one God, and he is above having a son. He does not do anything like humans, so he doesn't, create progeny. And I've actually included a depiction of Jesus over here, which kind of speaks to my wider thesis of people do stuff with Jesus that makes sense to them, and this is actually the baptism scene. And if you look at that for a while, you could probably hypothesize what part of the world it might come from, just based on the depiction of people. So probably somewhere, maybe Persia sort of area. So this is another thing I find fascinating, is that visually people like to make Jesus look like them. It's just an ordinary sort of human thing. Okay, we're going to go to the Middle Ages for a few minutes. I'm very aware of the time, and we'll do the best we can here. Great text that I find a lot of students, I've never heard of this before. There's something called the Heliand, which is an Anglo-Saxon text. We actually don't have that many writings in the language that this was written in. In fact, this may be the most complete writing, and then there's maybe a handful of other things. So 9th century, and I like to have my students read this because this is one of these extreme examples of how people make Jesus fit what they're familiar with. So this story should be kind of familiar, that a decree comes from, this is Fort Rome. All warrior heroes have to return to their assembly place, back to where their clan was a member by birth in a hill fort. This is a census story that happens at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. So they have to go back to their place of birth. And then they explain, going back to Bethlehem, this was the place where King David stood as Earl of the Hebrews. And you're like, what is an earl? It just so happens to be an Anglo-Saxon title of nobility. So this is a great example of how a story gets received. So remember reception history. Received into a new cultural context, and it starts to be tweaked in a way that make cultural sense to people. So instead of the city of Rome, it is now a fort, because those are the primary sort of settlements in this context. Instead of they use warrior heroes just for men leading households, basically. They use clans instead of families, hill forts instead of smaller villages. Again, Anglo-Saxon titles of nobility. And by the time we get to Jesus, so this is when Jesus is born, he was the chieftain of mankind. So they're, again, building in this kind of culturally specific language and turning Jesus into something that's meaningful for Anglo-Saxons. And there's a bit of a dark side here, too, because some people have hypothesized that this was probably written actually to make Saxons who were forced to convert to Christianity when they were conquered, to make them more amenable to this tradition. So it looks, like the heroes that they already kind of valorized and stuff. And there's another interesting text that does something similar, a poem actually called The Dream of the Rood. It also builds in a bunch of kind of Indo-European pagan elements into it to show that there's not that much different in Christianity than the traditions that these people were familiar with. So, still in the Middle Ages, we're actually going to look at a Jewish writing that tells the story of Jesus. And this is very polemical. So the context we need to keep in mind is that in certain periods in the Middle Ages, Jews were rampantly persecuted by Christians. Their houses burned down, places of work destroyed, shops and things like that, sometimes actually killed. So this is an anonymous story, which you need to be anonymous when you're about to critique Christians from a Jewish perspective here. So roughly 9th century, but it may actually draw on earlier traditions. And it's really meant to discredit Jesus. And again, I think it's important to study these, even though it's not true. None of this that they're saying is true, but it's showing how they were dealing with the idea of Jesus from a certain cultural perspective. So this is a story about a guy called Yeshu. They say a number of kind of implications. So he showed shameful disrespect of the sages who are rabbis. I'm just kind of reading the bold parts. He gave a improper, impudent interpretation of the Jewish law. So he doesn't know anything about the law is what they're saying. He discredited Moses somehow. He says that he could not be the greatest of the prophets if he had to receive counsel from Jethro. And then, I didn't put the whole quote in here because it's a little much for a Sunday morning, but he's accused of being the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier called Joseph Pandera, which shows up in a couple different texts, but illegitimate probably by sexual assault is what's implied, some kind of deception and then sexual assault. So they're really trying to make Jesus look bad, and this, in a context where Jewish folks are being persecuted, this is kind of empowering for them to put this out there in the world. And they even try to discredit the miraculous empty tomb at the end. So when they realize he's not in his grave, they look for the body and he's not found. And then this text says, well, a gardener had taken him from the grave and had brought him to his garden and buried him. So that's why he's not there. It's not that he resurrected. It's just somebody took him. So this one, you can really see the agenda here in some sense, is to definitely kind of discredit Jesus, discredit the Christians who followed these sorts of things. Okay, I'm going to briefly go to Eastern religions because there's some fun stuff going on in here. Don't have a lot of quotes for this, but I just want to kind of let you know what happens. So both of these religions exist before Christianity. They come in contact with Christianity in the colonial period, and they have to decide, what are we going to do with this new religion? And there are different options. Some people convert, some people are persuaded by it, some people reject it significantly, and some people think of ways to accommodate Jesus, and that's kind of what I'm showing here. So for instance, Hinduism has this concept of a kind of figure called the avatar, avatars are different expressions of gods in different forms. So like Krishna, Kali, things like that, who are there to help humans. So it's kind of an incarnation thing. So they start to understand Jesus as one of those avatars. Why not? We have so many other ones. Why not just add Jesus into the mix? And they come up with this idea of also Christ consciousness as some kind of a state of being that you can learn about, and that's similar to knowing what they call Brahman, which is the ultimate nature of reality. So their goal is to kind of figure that out, which liberates you from this cycle of rebirth. Pretty basic. I mean, Hinduism is a very different tradition, but they do find a way to build him in and to make sense of him. And the same thing in Buddhism. Buddhism has Buddhas, which are enlightened people, but also a figure called bodhisattvas. So people who figure out enlightenment, but they decide out of compassion to stay behind and help other people. And so that's how Jesus gets kind of accommodated by some forms of Buddhism. And there's actually a lot of parallels. People make a lot of parallels, but make much of these parallels between Siddhartha and the Buddha. And a lot of these are bolstered by legends of those lost years. So you have this kind of 18-year period where Jesus could have got anywhere. And so people start to think, well, maybe he went to Asia, and maybe he learned about those traditions, so maybe that's why he's so similar. So those lost years have been really fruitful, let's say, for this process. Let's see. Let's just talk about a few more. I definitely want to talk about what colonizers did with Jesus. So this is one of the sort of dark histories, and I've got one more that I want to make sure to mention. So this happens over 400-ish years. This kind of way of deploying Jesus uses him to support a white European imperial expansion, colonialism, and enslavement. And it's often under, I'm sure you've heard this before, the white man's burden, the idea that Europeans have to go out and bring their savior to other people who are in desperate need of him. Needless to say, like, that idea in itself is not necessarily violent or anything like that, but people used it to authorize violence, to authorize enslavement, to authorize all kinds of inequalities in colonial situations. And this is really when we start to see Jesus being emphasized as a white European figure. We can chart how this happens in artistic references. It's a little bit earlier than this. We start to see it in the Renaissance period, but this is really when people say, like, we have the right savior, and we have to bring it to other people who are different than us. And by the way, I just want to note, because there's a lot of scholarship seeing how this is working today. It's alive and well among some Christian nationalists in the US today who are using this idea of a white Jesus to argue that America is for white Christians and that other people either need to get with the program or get out. So there's a kind of a very dark side to what's going on here. Let's see, I'm gonna do just a really interesting, a very different perspective. I'm gonna skip forward 2 slides. And again, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint if you wanna see it. So W.E.B. Du Bois has a version of Jesus too. And I think this one's really interesting because it helps him deal with racial inequality that he was seeing. It's actually a short story called Jesus Christ in Texas. And Jesus is a stranger, he's never named, who witnesses racial inequality in different ways. So it's about a 8 to 9 page story. And the whole kind of theme of this story is people do not recognize Jesus, largely white people. They don't really understand who he is. They often see him in the dark, and when they're presented in the light, they're like, oh my gosh, he's been dark-skinned this whole time. So for instance, they had seen him in the glooming twilight, and there's a woman and the colonel, like, when the light is turned on, they realize they've been, talking to this person that they've been socialized to think is lesser than them, and they're trying to figure him out. So, I mean, even W.E.B. Du Bois is recognizing the kind of racial ambiguity and the way that his race has been molded for different purposes. So, what's interesting about this story, and it's widely available, all adult white characters in the story fail to recognize his identity, but all black characters and children, young white girl down here, she actually runs straight into his arms. So it's a kind of really interesting commentary on why don't, from his perspective, why don't white people understand Jesus or recognize Jesus, or in his perspective. So that's a kind of interesting moment where, racial issues are kind of at play. I'm going to skip, I think. I know the service starts at 10, so let me go through. Perhaps the most darkest one is what Hitler did with Jesus. There's a huge debate about, is Jesus really, is Hitler really a Christian? He does talk about things that Christians talk about, and obviously nobody wants to blame Christianity for what he did. That's not the point. But we do have writings where we can see Jesus being transformed into his Aryan warrior. So he talks about not imagining Jesus with anything but blonde and blue eyes, right? So that's his image of Jesus. Down here, his idea of Jesus as a fighter who fought against Jews, and he uses that as a reason that he too should be fighting against, as he says, the Jewish poison in his life. And then even further down in another writing, he talks about how the political actions he's carrying out promote the program of Jesus. So this is probably the most extreme example of how it doesn't matter who the historical Jesus was for him. He did something totally different, and some people bought into it for sure. And just the last one, I'm just going to skip over a couple things, is kind of to remind us what's going on today with the American Jesus. So there is something unique that happens in America with our figure of Jesus, and it's happening in our politics quite a bit as people fight over what kind of politics would he have. It emerges under the combination of Protestant Reformation, Great Awakening, also our American individualism and exceptionalism. One scholar has said he's infinitely adaptable, pliable, and merchandisable. We can do whatever we want with him. And in fact, a recent study actually found that when people are asked to rate Jesus on a political spectrum from left to right, you can often tell how they're going to rate them based on whether or not they approve of Christian nationalism, which is a very interesting feature. So if you like Christian nationalism, you're more likely to put Jesus on the far right. If you don't like it, you're more likely to put him on the left. And I think this is the reason I want to end on this, is just because this is something we're really going to have to think about. We tell ourselves that religion and politics are separate, but they are not. That is a myth. It's overlapping, and it's playing out right before our eyes, and we have to figure out what we're going to do with it. So I'm going to go ahead and end there. There's some other examples in there. Like I said, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint. I know you all are off to somewhere else, but if anybody wants to stick around with any questions, I'd be happy to chat, and I thank you all for your attendance today.